Somewhere in the quiet Norman countryside, a child was born with no legitimate claim to anything, yet he would die as the most powerful ruler in the Western world. He survived assassins, rebellions, and civil war before he ever set foot on a battlefield. In 1066, he crossed a sea with an army and changed the course of an entire civilization in a single autumn day. The people he conquered would spend generations absorbing his language, his castles, his laws, and his ambitions. But the mystery is not simply how he won, it is how a boy surrounded by enemies became the man who rewrote England. This is the story of William the Conqueror, and it begins not with triumph, but with danger. Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where ancient worlds awaken beneath quiet narration and the dust of centuries gently settles around you. If you find yourself here because history soothes you to sleep, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is truly the kind of storytelling you love. And if you feel moved to leave a comment, tell us where in the world you are right now and what the hour is where you sit. Somewhere tonight, strangers in a dozen different cities are dimming their lights for the very same story. There is something quietly wonderful about that. So let your shoulders drop, let the day release its hold, and allow yourself to drift into the story of the entire story of William the Conqueror. Chapter 1: The Bastard of Falaise, William's Dangerous Childhood. In the quiet hills of northern France, where the river Ante winds through limestone valleys and ancient orchards grow heavy with mist, there stands the town of Falaise. Its name, meaning cliff in the old tongue, speaks to the great pale rock face that rises above the town, and it was upon this commanding height that the Dukes of Normandy had long made their seat of power. It is here, in the shadow of that castle, around the year 1028, that a child came into the world who would one day remake the course of history. His name was William, and from the very first moment of his life the world was complicated. His father was Robert I, the 6th Duke of Normandy, a man known in his own time as Robert the Magnificent, and to later generations, in darker memory, as Robert the Devil. He was the younger son of Duke Richard II, and he had come to his title by uncertain means, following the sudden and suspicious death of his elder brother Richard III in 1027. Robert was bold, ambitious, and capable of great cruelty, yet also capable of contrition. He had once seized church lands and imprisoned his own uncle, the Archbishop of Rouen, along with a cousin who served as Bishop of Bayeux, yet he later reconciled with the clergy, restored what he had taken, and positioned himself as a dominant power in northern France. He was a man of extremes, restless and driven, who had secured the duchy's borders, gathered loyal barons around him, and involved himself in the shifting politics of neighbouring kingdoms. William's mother was a woman named Herleva, known also as Arlette, and she came from the town of Falaise itself. Her father, Fulbert, held the position of chamberlain in the Duke's household, and while later legend would sometimes describe him as a simple tanner, his family occupied a place among the prosperous burgher class, respected, comfortable, but not noble. The old tales say that Duke Robert first noticed Herleva as she washed clothes near the castle, and whether that story is entirely true or merely the beginning of a legend, what followed was a lasting relationship that would produce a child of great consequence. Yet Robert and Herleva never married, and that single fact would shape everything that followed. In the language of the medieval church, William was illegitimate, born of a union outside the bonds of sanctified marriage to a mother whose blood carried no noble lineage. The Latin word sometimes used was nothus, a term that marked a child as being of mixed noble and common origin. In the eyes of ecclesiastical law, such a child was ordinarily barred from inheriting titles and lands. Succession was meant to pass through children of lawful marriage, and William was, by that strict reckoning, excluded. But the world is rarely so simple. Robert I had never married. He left behind no children born within the bonds of the church. William was his only acknowledged son, his only male heir, the single thread of continuity available to the duchy. And so when the time came, Robert made his choice. He named William his heir. The boy who would one day be called the Conqueror was to be Duke of Normandy. Robert's departure from his duchy came around the year 1035. He had made a solemn vow to undertake a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a journey that carried both profound spiritual meaning and considerable personal risk. Such pilgrimages were not common among the most powerful rulers of the age, though they were not entirely without precedent. To travel to the Holy Land was to seek absolution, to demonstrate piety, to acquire the spiritual prestige that came with such sacrifice. It was, in the medieval imagination, an act of penitence and devotion of the highest order. Before he left, Robert called a council of the most powerful men in Normandy. In January of 1035, the Norman magnates gathered, and Robert asked them to swear an oath of fealty to his young son William, barely 7 years old. Among those who gave their oath were the Archbishop of Rouen and two powerful nobles, Osbern, a nephew of Gunnar, the wife of Richard I, and Gilbert of Brienne, a grandson of Richard I. Robert also sought the protection of King Henry I of France, Normandy's feudal overlord, asking the king to serve as guardian to his child. With these arrangements made, Robert set out for Jerusalem. He would never return. He reached the Holy City, completing the pilgrimage he had vowed to make. But illness overtook him on the journey home, and in early July of 1035, Robert I died at Nicaea, far to the east in what is today northwestern Turkey. He was not yet 40 years old, and in Normandy, a child of roughly 7 or 8 years now bore the title of Duke. The duchy that William had inherited was a remarkable place with a remarkable history. Only a little more than a century before his birth, Normandy had been something else entirely. In the year 911, a Frankish king named Charles the Simple had concluded a treaty with a Viking leader named Rollo at a place called St. Clair-sur-Epte. In exchange for the coastal lands around Rouen, Rollo agreed to convert to Christianity, to marry into the Frankish nobility, and to swear fealty to the French crown. He became the first count, and in time Duke, of Normandy. Rollo's people were Norse, Danes, Norwegians, Norse Gaels, settlers from the broader Scandinavian world, and they'd come first as raiders, wintering along the Seine, pressing deeper into Frankish territory season after season. But the treaty transformed them. Over the following generations, they intermarried with the local population, abandoned the Old Norse language in favour of the Languedoc that would become Norman French, adopted Frankish feudal customs and Catholic rites, and steadily extended their territory westward. By the time of William's birth, Normandy was no longer a Viking enclave. It was a feudal principality, autonomous, formidable, and formally a vassal of the French crown, yet functioning in many ways as a power unto itself. The Norman dukes exercised authority over their domain through a web of vassalage and castellanies, a hierarchical structure of loyalty and land that bound knights, lords, and churchmen to the ducal house. The church too was woven through this fabric. Bishops and abbots controlled vast tracts of land, supplied knights for military service, administered law, and provided the literate class that kept the machinery of governance in motion. To hold Normandy was to hold a balance of forces, noble, clerical, and royal, that required constant management. For an orphan child of 8, named Bastard by law and custom, that balance was an impossible thing to maintain. The violence began almost immediately after Robert's death. The Norman barons who had sworn to protect William saw in the boy's minority an opportunity. Rival factions moved. Powerful men who'd been held in check by Robert's authority now began to assert themselves, and William, small and vulnerable, was caught in the middle. His guardians died one by one. Osbern de Crepon, William's chamberlain and one of those who had sworn to protect him, was murdered in William's own hall. Gilbert of Brienne, another of his appointed protectors, was killed on the orders of rival barons. The child duke was moved again and again from one place of concealment to another. His mother's brother, a man named Walter, took turns sleeping in William's chamber at night, and when danger drew close, Walter would lift the sleeping child from his bed in the darkness and carry him to safety, not to great castles or fortified halls, but to the modest homes of humble Norman tenants, the poorest households in the countryside, where no one would think to look for a duke. Those years left their mark. William grew up knowing that the world was a dangerous place, that the people closest to power were often the most willing to use violence, and that survival required both cunning and the loyalty of those who had little reason to betray. The chronicles of the age, written by men such as William of Jumièges and later by Orderic Vitalis, describe the chaos of this period only in broad strokes. The court chaplain William of Poitiers would later write a biography clearly shaped by admiration and the desire to present his subject in the finest possible light. The sources are few and they are biased, and they must be read carefully. But what they agree upon is this: William survived when other children would not have, and he survived because others risked themselves for him. Among the threats he faced were some of the most powerful figures in the region. His cousin Alan III of Brittany, who served nominally as his protector, himself held a blood connection to Normandy that made his motives uncertain. His own uncle, William of Arques, would later openly rebel and seek French support against him. And King Henry I of France, who had promised to be William's guardian, proved to be an unpredictable ally at best, supportive when it suited his interests, and later a source of interference and opposition when the political winds shifted. Herleva, William's mother, did not remain in that uncertain world between the ducal court and obscurity. Around 1031, while Robert was still alive, she married a nobleman named Herluin de Conteville, a match that suited her family's standing. Through this marriage, she had two sons who would become significant figures in their brother William's later life: Odo, who rose to become Bishop of Bayeux, and Robert, who became Count of Mortagne. She also had daughters, one of whom married Richard Le Goz, Viscount of Avranchy. Herleva died around 1050, in her mid-40s, and was laid to rest at the Abbey of Grestin, which her husband and her son Robert had founded. For William, growing up in those years was to grow up in a world of competing loyalties, sudden losses, and the ever-present knowledge that he was considered, by many powerful men, not quite legitimate, not quite theirs to respect. He was the bastard of Falaise, a label that followed him through his childhood and into his youth, used by enemies to question his right to the title he bore. Yet something in him, shaped perhaps by those nights of being carried through the dark by the deaths of men who stood between him and harm, by the courage of a humble uncle who slept beside him to keep him safe, something in him hardened and deepened into a quality that those who knew him would later recognize as formidable. The Duchy of Normandy, with its Viking roots and its French feudal present, its powerful church and its ambitious barons, had been built on generations of struggle. It had been shaped by the men who made themselves through force of will and calculation, and the child who grew up hidden among the poor households of its countryside, who learned what it meant to be protected by the devotion of others rather than by the rights of birth, was absorbing lessons that no chronicle could fully record. But survival alone was not enough. William had to transform from a child kept alive by the courage of others into a ruler capable of enforcing his own authority, and that transformation would be tested on the battlefield. Chapter 2: The Young Duke, Consolidating Normandy and the Alliance with Matilda. In the rolling countryside of northern France, where ancient rivers carved their quiet paths between forests of oak and fields of pale winter grain, a young man was slowly learning what it meant to rule. William of Normandy had inherited his duchy as a child, surrounded by men who saw his illegitimate birth not as a minor detail, but as an open wound in the body of Norman power. And so as he grew into a world of resistance. The great Norman families had long enjoyed something close to independence. They held their castles, commanded their own private armies, collected their own revenues, and administered their own justice. The arrival of a centralizing duke, one who wished to impose new taxes, install his own loyal followers in key strongholds, and draw power back toward the ducal seat, was not welcome. The leading houses of the time, among them the formidable de Bellême family and the lords of the Cotentin and the Avranchin, raised their voices and then, eventually, their weapons. They argued that William's birth made his claim to the duchy invalid, but behind that argument lay something older and more stubborn, the desire to keep what had always been theirs. The tension that had been gathering for years finally broke in the year 1047 on a gently undulating plain just west of what is now the village of Conteville in Normandy. The place was called Vallée d'Une. It was here that William, still a young man, chose to confront the rebel barons directly rather than wait for their resistance to harden further. He did not face them alone. William had called upon King Henry I of France, his feudal overlord, for support. The relationship between Normandy and the French crown at this time was layered with ancient obligation. The duchy was, in the formal language of the age, a fief held from the French king. The duke owed him homage, fealty, and military service. Yet in practice, Norman dukes had always governed their lands with near total independence. The king's authority was largely symbolic, invoked only in moments when the balance of power needed to be restored. This was such a moment. Henry not afford to see his northern frontier dissolve into chaos, and so he rode alongside William, personally joining the royal army that met the rebels at Vallée d'Une. The battle that unfolded on that open plain was decided not by numbers but by discipline. William's mounted forces, organised into tight formations of cavalry, groups of riders who had trained together, who understood how to charge in coordinated waves and wheel around the flanks of an enemy, broke through the rebel lines with a precision the insurgents could not match. The Norman military tradition of the 11th century placed the cavalry at the very centre of warfare. These mounted soldiers, known as milites, were bound to their lord by both land and loyalty. They trained to couch the lance beneath the arm to absorb the shock of impact and redirect it into the enemy. They moved together, forming larger battle groups that could execute feigned retreats and sudden flanking charges. The rebels, numerous but poorly coordinated, lacking unified command, could not hold against it. The victory was swift. The immediate consequences of Vallée d'Une were significant, though not complete. William secured his position as Duke across much of Normandy. He moved quickly to invoke the Truce of God, a church-led movement that had been growing across northern France, seeking to limit the private warfare of the nobility by forbidding armed conflict on specified days and threatening spiritual sanctions against those who violated its terms. After his victory, William convened a council of his clergy at Caen and had the truce imposed on his vassals. It was a careful move. By positioning himself as the protector of both secular order and ecclesiastical peace, He removed the legitimacy from noble feuds and presented the ducal office as the natural centre of Norman life. He himself was exempted from the truce's restrictions, which meant his authority to enforce order could not be constrained by the very rules he imposed on others. Yet the eastern portions of the duchy remained unsettled. The stronghold of Brionne held out under rebel control for several more years, finally surrendering only after a prolonged siege in 1050. William's triumph at Valles-Dunes had been decisive, but consolidation was a slow and patient work. When he did deal with those who had opposed him, William's methods varied with circumstance. Estates were confiscated, titles stripped away. Some rebel lords were imprisoned, others were sent into exile, compelled to flee beyond Normandy's borders. A few who submitted quickly and renewed their oaths of loyalty were allowed to recover a portion of what they had lost. It was governance through calculated mercy and calculated severity, an approach that would mark his rule for decades to come. While William worked to quiet the rebellion within his borders, threats gathered beyond them as well. To the south, the county of Anjou was ruled by Geoffrey II, known as Martel, the Hammer. He had inherited the ambitions of his father Fulk III and amplified them. Geoffrey had seized Touraine and large portions of Maine, pressing steadily against Normandy's southern frontier. His capture of key frontier towns such as Domfront and Alençon created continuous pressure, forcing William into costly defensive campaigns that drained resources and attention he could not easily hem. The conflict over Maine in particular would prove difficult to resolve. By around 1051, the region had formally recognised Angevin authority, and the Norman attempt to wrest it back had stalled without a decisive outcome. It was a border left unresolved, a wound that would continue to matter for years. More troubling still was the slow shift in the attitude of King Henry I of France. The alliance that had served William so well at Valles-Dunes did not endure. As William's power grew and his ambitions became clearer, the French king grew uneasy. A Normandy strong enough to resist rebellion was one thing. A Normandy strong enough to project power outward was another. By the early 1050s, Henry had drawn closer to Geoffrey Martel, and what had once been a protective relationship between overlord and vassal had quietly transformed into open antagonism. The two men who had ridden together at Valles-Dunes would eventually face each other as rivals, the French king and his erstwhile Norman ward caught in the inevitable friction of competing ambitions. It was against this complicated background, of internal consolidation still in progress, of external threats pressing from the south, and of a French alliance beginning to fracture, that William made a decision that would reshape the political landscape of Northern Europe. He sought the hand of Matilda, daughter of Count Baldwin V of Flanders. Baldwin V was one of the most consequential political figures of his generation. He ruled Flanders from 1035 until his death in 1067, presiding over a territory that sat at the crossroads between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Flemish counts held the status of French peers for their western lands, while simultaneously serving as imperial vassals for territories east of the Scheldt, giving them a rare kind of leverage in both great courts. Flanders had grown wealthy through its cloth industry and its position along the trade routes that connected the North Sea to the Mediterranean and the Baltic. Baldwin had used that wealth and that geographic importance to act as a diplomatic power in his own right, sheltering exiled queens, arranging strategic marriages, and serving as co-regent of France for the young King Philip I. His family's web of alliances stretched in every direction. Matilda herself was a remarkable figure. Born around 1031, she was the daughter of Baldwin V and Adela of France, daughter of King Robert II, which gave her blood ties to the French royal house and, through other lines, connections to the German imperial court and even to the Anglo-Saxon dynasties of England. She had been raised in the sophisticated court of Flanders, educated in Latin, religious doctrine, and the practical administration of estates. Contemporary accounts describe her as small in stature but commanding in presence, sharp, politically astute, and possessed of a strong-willed ambition that earned both respect and wariness in the chronicles of her time. The marriage, however, was not without its complications. The Church raised a serious objection. Pope Leo IX, reinforced by the Synod of Rheims in 1049, had formally forbidden the union on grounds of consanguinity. William and Matilda were related within the degrees of kinship that canon law required to be free for a valid marriage. Count Baldwin was ordered not to permit his daughter's hand to go to the illegitimate Norman duke. Despite the papal ban, William and Matilda married nonetheless, sometime around 1051 or 1052. It was a bold defiance of ecclesiastical authority, and it carried consequences that would take years to resolve. The resolution, when it came, was characteristically pragmatic. Pope Nicholas II granted the couple a dispensation in 1059, formally sanctioning the marriage that had already stood for nearly a decade. The price of that sanction was penance. Each spouse was required to found a monastery. William established the men's abbey of Saint-Étienne, the abbey of St. Stephen on the western side of Caen, while Matilda founded the women's abbey of La Trinité, the abbey of the Holy Trinity on the eastern side. Both were begun around 1062 and dedicated by 1066. They were not merely acts of contrition. They became anchors of Norman ducal power in Caen, monuments to the dynasty's piety, administrative centres of the church in Normandy, and eventually burial sites. William laid to rest within Saint-Étienne, Matilda within La Trinité. Stone and prayer binding a dynasty to a city. In the years that followed their marriage, William and Matilda built something that went beyond political alliance. They built a family. Together they had 10 children, 4 sons and 6 daughters. Robert, the eldest, was born around 1053. Richard followed around 1055. William, who would one day be known as William Rufus, came around 1060. And Henry, the youngest son and future king, was born in late 1068. Their daughters, Adeliza, Cecilia, Matilda, Constance, Adelaire, and Agatha, were born across these same years, their precise birth order less clearly recorded by the chronicles, but their presence woven through the political life of the Norman court. Matilda's role extended well beyond the bearing of heirs. When William was away, and he was often away, campaigning in England or managing the endless affairs of a contested duchy, it was Matilda who governed Normandy in his absence. She acted as regent on multiple occasions, hearing land pleas, issuing charters, administering justice, and using her own resources to maintain order and endow churches. She was, in every practical sense, the governing mind of Normandy during those long intervals when her husband's attention was required elsewhere. Her capacity for this work had been shaped by her upbringing, by the court of Flanders where powerful women managed powerful estates, and by a personal intelligence that the chronicles, even when they sought to diminish her, could not quite conceal. The alliance that William had forged through marriage to Matilda changed the geometry of northern European politics. Flanders was now bound to Normandy by blood and interest. The threat from France and Anjou had not dissolved, but the addition of Flemish connections, diplomatic, dynastic, commercial, gave William a counterweight he had not possessed before. He had entered his early years of rule as an illegitimate duke fighting for survival against his own barons. He had emerged from that crucible with a duchy more firmly held, a church more carefully managed, and a marriage that brought him into the highest circles of European power. Normandy, slowly, was becoming something coherent. The rebellions had been suppressed or exhausted. The Truce of God had given the ducal office a moral authority that supplemented its military one. The the great abbeys at Caen were rising from the earth, their stone towers reaching above the rooftops as a visible declaration of the dynasty's permanence. And beside William, quiet and capable and deeply rooted in the politics of her age, stood Matilda, daughter of Flanders, Duchess of Normandy, and mother of kings not yet born. With Normandy secured and a powerful alliance formed through his marriage, William's gaze turned toward England, where a succession crisis was quietly building into something that would demand his full ambition. Chapter 3: The Oath, the Crown, and Three Kings, the Road to 1066. There is a moment in history when the threads of many lives draw together, slowly, almost quietly, until they form something immense and irreversible. The year 1066 was such a moment, but to understand it, one must begin earlier, much earlier, in the cold courts of Normandy, where a young English prince sat far from his homeland, watching and waiting, learning the ways of men who were not his own. Edward, the son of King Ethelred the Unready and his Norman wife Emma, had been driven from England twice before he was grown. First in 1013, when Viking raiders under Sweyn Forkbeard swept across the land and forced the royal family to flee across the sea to Normandy. Then again in 1016, when the Danish conqueror Canute claimed the English throne entirely, and Edward's exile stretched on for years, nearly a quarter of a century in total. He grew into manhood among the Normans, witnessing their charters, learning their customs, receiving the support of Norman nobles such as Duke Robert I, who even mounted an ill-fated attempt to restore Edward to England in 1034. Those long years abroad left their mark. When Harthacnut finally invited Edward back to England in 1041, and when Edward was crowned king the following year, he carried Normandy with him, in his friendships, in his faith, in the clerics and courtiers he gathered around him. Among those friendships, none would prove more consequential than the one he maintained with William, Duke of Normandy, a kinsman he trusted, a man he'd known across the long, quiet years of exile. Edward's England, meanwhile, was not simply his to command. The kingdom rested upon a careful arrangement of powers, the king at its centre, and around him the Witan, that ancient council of the realm's most powerful men. Bishops and abbots, aldermen and thanes gathered in royal halls to advise on law and war, to ratify charters, to collect the great tax known as Danegeld, and when a king died, to confirm who would wear the crown next. These men were not mere advisors, they shaped the kingdom itself. And among these men, no family shaped it more profoundly than the House of Godwin. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, had risen from the relatively modest station of a Sussex thane to become the most powerful nobleman in England. He had navigated the turbulent waters of Danish rule under Knut, married into Danish noble lines, and placed his children at the highest levels of English power. His sons held earldoms across the land. His daughter Edith became Edward's queen, and when his son Harold inherited the earldom of Wessex after Godwin's death in 1053, the family's reach extended across nearly all of England. Harold Godwinson was, in almost every practical sense, the second man in the kingdom, a capable soldier, a skilled diplomat, a man of courage and ambition in equal measure. Edward had no children. His queen bore him no heirs. And so the question of who would follow him onto the throne of England drifted through the years of his reign like a whisper no one could quite hear clearly. Norman sources insist that Edward made his answer plain. They claim that he told William of Normandy, his trusted kinsman, his old ally, that the crown would pass to him. The Norman chronicler William of Poitiers recorded this promise with certainty, but the Anglo-Saxon chronicles are silent on the matter. They mention no such pledge, and Edward's later actions tell a complicated story. He brought the young Edgar Etheling, the last male of the old royal bloodline back to England, suggesting he may have looked elsewhere for his successor, who restored the Godwin family after their brief exile in 1051. He left the question unresolved, or perhaps deliberately open until the very end. What is certain is that in the spring of 1064, Harold Godwinson sailed to Normandy. The precise reason remains uncertain. Most likely he crossed the Channel seeking the release of his brother Wulfnoth and his nephew Hakon, who had been held as hostages by the Normans for years. But Harold never arrived as intended. His ship was blown off course, and he was seized by Count Guy of Ponthieu, who held him prisoner. It was William of Normandy who intervened. He negotiated Harold's release, and then, with a kind of careful hospitality, drew Harold into his orbit. The two men rode together on a Norman campaign against Conan of Brittany. Near the sands of the river below Mont Saint-Michel, Harold reportedly rescued two Norman knights who had become trapped in the quicksand, an act of bravery that the Normans noted with admiration. He fought alongside them at the siege of Dol and the capture of Dinan. He was knighted by William himself and given arms. And then came the oath. In the presence of William and his assembled nobles, with his hands resting upon relics, sacred remains of saints held within great gilded altars, Harold swore. The Bayeux tapestry, woven in the years after the Conquest, shows him standing between two reliquaries, his arms outstretched, his body bent slightly forward in the posture of a man making a solemn vow. Norman sources record that he declared himself William's man, swearing fealty, promising to obey, and pledging to support William's claim to the English crown. In the world of the 11th century, such an oath was not a simple formality. To swear upon a holy relic was to call down the saints themselves as witnesses. The bones and remains of the holy dead were believed to carry divine power, to serve as conduits between the living world and heaven. To break such an oath was not merely a political betrayal, it was a sin against God and the saint whose relics had been touched. The weight of that moment, whatever its precise circumstances, would hang over Harold Godwinson for the rest of his life. English voices, however, tell a different story. They say that Harold was a hostage, a captive taken by force, and that any oath sworn under such conditions was coerced. Pragmatic words spoken to secure his freedom and perhaps the release of his kinsman, not a sincere promise to surrender England's crown to a foreign duke. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records no oath, no promise, no binding commitment. The Norman version, English historians have long argued, was shaped by the need to justify an invasion, to cast Harold as a perjurer whose betrayal of a sacred vow had brought divine punishment upon him. The truth, as with so many moments from this ancient time, rests somewhere in the silence between the two accounts. Harold returned to England before the winter of 1064. Edward the Confessor continued to reign, his health slowly declining. In the autumn of 1065, a rebellion swept through Northumbria, forcing the exile of Harold's own brother Tostig, who had served as earl there. Harold negotiated Tostig's removal to prevent civil war, a practical decision, but one that tore the brothers apart. Tostig felt betrayed. He felt abandoned, and that wound would not heal. Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January, 1066 at Westminster. He had been too ill even to attend the consecration of his beloved Westminster Abbey on the 28th of December, a ceremony he had spent years preparing for. He left behind no heir, no clear successor, only an aging kingdom and a gathering storm. The next morning the Witan assembled. They chose Harold Godwinson as their king. That same day, the 6th of January, in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey, Harold was crowned, the ceremony performed by Stigand, Archbishop of Canterbury. England had a king, but the question of who had the right to be that king was far from settled. 3 men looked at the English crown and believed it should be theirs. William of Normandy had the Norman accounts of Edward's promise, and now Harold's oath sworn upon holy relics. He began to prepare. Harald Hardrada of Norway pressed a claim rooted in older agreements, a succession pact that traced back through the Danish kings, through Magnus the Good, to the promise that the English throne would pass to Norway's rulers when the line of Danish kings failed. Harald Hardrada was a formidable man. He had served as a Varangian Guard commander in Byzantium, fought as a mercenary across the Eastern world, and reclaimed the Norwegian throne after years of exile. He was not a man who made idle claims, and Tostig, bitter, exiled, furious, came to Harald Hardrada with knowledge, with grievance, and with a willingness to offer his brother's kingdom to a foreign king if it meant reclaiming what he had lost. The Norwegian invasion came first. A fleet of perhaps 300 ships crossed the North Sea and made landfall in the north of England. On the 20th of September 1066, just south of York at a place called Gate Fulford, Harold Hardrada and Tostig met the forces of the northern English earls Edwin and Morcar. The battle was fierce. The Norse army outflanked the English, driving them into the surrounding marshes, and won a decisive victory. York lay open before them. Far to the south, Harold received the news. He gathered his housecarls and his thanes, and he marched. Nearly 185 miles in 4 days, through the autumn countryside, through fields already turning golden and brown, pressing north at a pace that left men breathless, but did not stop them. On the 25th of September, Harold's army descended on the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge, a village on the River Derwent east of York. The Norse forces were caught unprepared, many of them without their armour in the mild autumn warmth. The fighting was brutal and complete. Harald Hardrada fell early in the battle, struck by an English arrow in the throat. Tostig died later in the same desperate struggle, the brothers' bitter estrangement ending not in reconciliation, but in blood. The Norse army was broken. The ships that had carried 300 vessels across the sea sailed home with only a handful. England had survived. Harold stood victorious on the banks of the Derwent, his soldiers exhausted, his kingdom briefly safe, but the celebrations lasted only days. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, on the 28th of September, William of Normandy's fleet crossed the English Channel in the darkness of night and came ashore at dawn on the stony beach at Pevensey, on the southern coast of England. The kingdom that Harold had just defended in the north now faced a new threat in the south. The autumn leaves were still falling, the soldiers' boots were still worn from the northern march, and somewhere on a hillside in Sussex, history was already waiting. Harold had won a stunning victory in the north, but the celebration was brief. William the Conqueror had already set foot on English soil, and the kingdom's fate would be decided on a hillside in Sussex before the leaves of autumn had finished falling. Chapter 4. The Battle of Hastings, October 14th, 1066. The Sussex coast lay quiet in the grey autumn light, the tide rolling gently against the ancient shoreline where, not so long before, a great fleet had drawn itself to land. William, Duke of Normandy, had come ashore near the old Roman fort at Pevensey, a place the Romans had once called their own, a place of crumbling stone walls and deep history, and now it belonged, at least for a moment, to him. From Pevensey, the sea stretched westward behind the Norman army, and the English countryside spread before it. William did not simply wait. He moved his forces along the Sussex coast and began to ravage the surrounding land with deliberate and calculated purpose. Villages burned quietly in the autumn air. Livestock were taken or slaughtered. Crops that had grown through the long English summer were destroyed. It was not cruelty for its own sake, or not entirely. It was strategy. By stripping the countryside of food and shelter, William ensured that no enemy force could live off the land, that no resistant lord could gather strength in the shadows. He was drawing Harold out, forcing a response, making the silence of the countryside speak loudly enough that the English king would have no choice but to come south and answer. And Harold did come. Though the precise manner of his arrival has been debated by historians ever since, the traditional account describes a march of extraordinary speed, roughly 200 miles from Yorkshire to the south coast in the space of 10 days. Some scholars have questioned whether that march ever happened at all, suggesting instead that Harold may have sailed south by sea, a faster and less grueling route. The debate has never been fully resolved. What remains clear is that Harold arrived with haste, and that haste, whether born of urgency, confidence, or a desire to protect the ravaged lands of his own earldom, would shape everything that followed. The two armies met on the 14th of October, near a ridge of land not far from the town of Hastings. The place chosen by Harold for his stand was a long, narrow crest, known as Senlac Hill, a raised spine of ground whose approaches were steep and whose flanks were protected by low, wet, marshy ground that clung to either side like a natural moat. Harold had chosen well. The high ground gave his men an advantage of elevation. The boggy terrain on the flanks made cavalry approaches difficult, channeling any mounted assault toward the steep front. It was a position that spoke of experience and tactical intelligence. Harold's army was almost entirely composed of infantry. At its heart stood the housecarls, a relatively small elite force of professional warriors, perhaps around 3,000 men, equipped with heavy armour and the great two-handed Danish axes that could split a shield or sever a limb with a single sweeping blow. Around and behind them stretched the Fyrd, the larger body of the English host, farmers and craftsmen and freemen summoned from across the kingdom, armed with spears and axes and swords, wearing leather jerkins and carrying round wooden shields. Together they may have numbered somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 men. They had almost no cavalry and only a handful of archers. Facing them from the valley below was William's army, a force of similar size, but very differently composed. The Norman host was organised into three broad sections. At the centre stood the Norman corps itself, anchored by William and his principal commanders, including his half-brothers Bishop Odo of Bayeux and Count Robert of Mortain. This central contingent included perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 mounted knights, heavily armed cavalry whose horses gave them aid and the terrible momentum of a charge, alongside comparable numbers of armoured infantry and a forward screen of lightly armed archers. On the left flank, the Breton contingent under Count Alan the Red brought perhaps 2,000 fighters from Brittany and the western French lands. On the right, mercenaries and allies from Flanders, Picardy and Boulogne completed the line, numbering perhaps 1,500. The morning mist had not yet fully lifted when the battle began. The Norman archers moved forward first, loosing their arrows in long arcing volleys intended to fall down upon the heads of the men sheltering behind the great shield wall. The tactic was deliberate, to loft the shafts high, so they would descend past the overlapping shields and strike the men behind. For a time the arrows found their marks among the densely packed English infantry, but the shield wall held. It was a remarkable thing, that wall. Warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their round shields pressed together or overlapping, the front rank presenting a near unbroken barrier of wood and iron to the world, while the men behind added depth and strength. When a horse approached that wall at a gallop, instinct and the forest of out-thrust spears and axes made the animal wheel away. The cavalry charges that followed the arrow volleys crashed toward the English line and broke apart, unable to find purchase against that steady, immovable mass of men. For hours the struggle continued in this way. The Normans advanced, were met, fell back, reformed, and advanced again. The ridge held its defenders with stubborn, ancient patience. And then, somewhere on the left flank of the Norman line, something shifted. The Breton contingent faltered. Whether they had broken in genuine panic or had pulled back for some other reason, what appeared to the watching English was a retreat, the left flank of the Norman army seeming to collapse and flee down the slope. And at that sight, something in the English discipline loosened. A portion of the feared broke from the shield wall and rushed forward in pursuit, drawn by the instinct to press an advantage, to run down a fleeing enemy. It was the moment that changed everything. The Normans turned on the pursuing English, who were now separated from their wall, their flanks exposed, their formation dissolved. Whether the retreat had been planned or accidental, whether it was a deliberate feint or a genuine rout that was opportunistically reversed, historians have argued about ever since. The Norman chronicler William of Poitiers describes it as a planned manoeuvre. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle speaks only of a flight. The truth perhaps lies somewhere between the two. A rout that became a counterattack, chaos transformed by instinct and experience into something resembling strategy. Whatever the origin, the result was devastating. The English soldiers who had broken formation were surrounded and cut down. At almost the same moment, a rumour swept through the Norman ranks that William had fallen. The panic began to ripple outward, threatening to undo everything. William rode forward through the confusion, lifted his helmet from his head so his face could be seen clearly by the men around him, and shouted above the noise of the battlefield. He was alive. He still fought. God would grant him victory. The sight of their duke unmistakably present and unmistakably commanding stopped the fear before it could spread further. He led a countercharge personally and the line stabilised once more. As the long autumn afternoon wore on, the same pattern repeated. Norman cavalry and infantry pressing uphill against the diminishing English wall. Feigned retreats luring more of the feared out of position, the shield wall growing thinner with each exchange. The housecarls held longest, as one would expect of professionals. Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, fell somewhere in the fighting. Their deaths recorded in both the chronicles and the long thread of the Bayeux Tapestry's embroidered narrative. And then Harold himself fell. How he died has been one of the enduring mysteries of that long October day. The earliest accounts are specific but do not mention an arrow. The Carmen de Astingui Proelio, written shortly after the battle, describes a brutal end, a sword blow to the breast, a strike that severed his head below the helmet, a lance thrust to the belly, a slash to the thigh. William of Jumièges, writing around 1070, says only that Harold fell covered with deadly wounds. It is not until the 12th century in the work of William of Malmesbury that the famous arrow wound appears. Harold's brain pierced by an arrow, his thigh cut by a Norman sword. The Bayeux Tapestry, created in England in the early 1070s, likely under the patronage of Bishop Odo himself, shows a figure beneath the inscription Hic Harold Rex interfectus est. Here King Harold is killed, and what appears to be an arrow near the head. But even that image has been questioned. Early engravings suggest the figure may have originally held a spear rather than been struck by an arrow, with the arrow perhaps added during a 19th century restoration. Some historians have suggested that the arrow through the eye image was a symbolic choice, echoing the medieval understanding that a perjurer, one who breaks an oath, dies through the eye, reinforcing the Norman narrative that Harold had broken his sacred vow to William. What is certain is that Harold died on Senlac Hill as the light faded from the October sky, and that with his death the English resistance broke apart. In the chaos that followed the collapse of the shield wall, some of the retreating English were swallowed by the terrain that had protected them earlier. A deep, overgrown ditch, later remembered as the Malfosse, the evil ditch, caught men and horses alike in the darkness and confusion. riders tumbling into the hidden hollow, bodies piling beneath hooves and the weight of armour. It was a grim end to a day already soaked in blood. William's losses had been significant, perhaps as many as 2,000 men, roughly a third of the force he had brought across the Channel. The chronicles noted the toll, but William held the field, and in the calculus of medieval warfare, holding the field was everything. In the days that followed, the dead were gathered from the churned earth of Senlac Hill and buried in mass graves on the eastern side of the battlefield. Harold's mutilated body was identified, according to tradition, by a woman who had known him intimately, who recognised a mark that only she knew. His mother sought to ransom his remains and was refused. The body was eventually taken from the field and buried, quietly and without ceremony, near the sea. Later accounts would say it was moved to Waltham Abbey, where Harold had been a great patron, to rest beneath the nave in the shadow of the church he had loved. Years later, William would fulfill a vow he had made before the battle, constructing an abbey on the very ground where the fighting had taken place. Its high altar positioned, so it was said, on the exact spot where Harold had fallen. Battle Abbey rose slowly from the Sussex earth, a Benedictine monument built in penance and commemoration, its stones pressing down into ground that still remembered the weight of 10,000 men. The great Bayeux tapestry, that extraordinary embroidered cloth nearly 70 metres long, commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux and worked by skilled hands in England in the years following the Conquest, would preserve the memory of the day in thread and linen. It recorded the ships and the crossing, the knights and the archers, the burning villages and the desperate shield wall, the falling king and the fleeing English. It was propaganda sewn into cloth, history shaped by the hand of the victor, and yet it remains one of the most vivid and irreplaceable records of that October afternoon that any century has left behind. The battle was over, but England had not yet surrendered, and William would now face the harder, slower work of transforming a military victory into a permanent conquest. Chapter 5: The Conquest of England, Castles, Rebellion, and the Harrying of the North. After the dust of Hastings had settled, and the last echoes of that fateful October battle had faded into the English countryside, William of Normandy did not pause. He moved steadily, methodically, like a tide that had already decided the shape of the shore it would claim. From the battlefield he turned westward and northward, tracing a careful arc through the heart of southern England. Canterbury yielded. Dover, with its commanding white cliffs and its strategic port, opened its gates. Southampton followed, then Rochester, after only a brief resistance. Each town that surrendered added weight to the impression that the old order was already dissolving, that the ground itself was shifting beneath English feet. At Wallingford, a crossing of the Thames was secured, and it was here that Archbishop Stigand, one of the most powerful churchmen in England, came forward and offered his submission. At Berkhamsted, the gathering of English lords who came to give homage was remarkable for who stood among them. Edgar the Etheling, the young man who had been briefly acclaimed as king after Harold's death, arrived alongside the great northern Earls Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin of Mercia, and with them came Archbishop Eldred of York. One by one the pillars of Anglo-Saxon authority bent. London, that great mercantile heart, capitulated through negotiation rather than force. Winchester surrendered, and with it came Harold's treasury, the accumulated wealth of a kingdom now passing into different hands. England's ancient southern capital quietly changed allegiance, and with it the last practical resistance in the south dissolved. On Christmas Day 1066, in the Abbey Church of Westminster, William was crowned King of England. The ceremony was conducted by Archbishop Aldred of York, for Stigand had been excommunicated and could not perform the rite. Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances addressed the gathered Norman lords in French, while Ealdred spoke to the English nobles assembled within the stone walls. Both peoples were asked to give their assent, and both did, loudly. It was that loudness that caused the first crisis of William's reign, though a brief one. The Norman soldiers stationed outside the abbey, hearing the great shouts rising from within, misread the noise as the sound of rebellion. In their alarm, they set fire to nearby houses and began to loot the surrounding streets. Smoke drifted across the grey winter sky. People rushed from the church in fear, and the ceremony teetered on the edge of chaos. Yet the bishops held their ground at the altar. The anointing was completed, the crown was placed, and William, trembling, whether from emotion exhaustion or the shock of the moment, was king. It was not the serene coronation that history might have imagined, but it was done. Yet a crown does not secure a kingdom by itself. In the months and years that followed, England proved restless, resistant, and deeply unwilling to accept its new rulers without struggle. The first uprisings came quickly. In 1067, Anglo-Saxon forces in Kent joined with Eustace II of Boulogne in an attempt to seize Dover Castle, a strike at one of William's most essential strongholds. In the west, a thane named Edric, remembered by later generations as Edric the Wild, rallied local nobles and allied himself with the Welsh princes of Gwynedd and Powys, leading raids deep into Hereford and the borderlands. The western marches burned fitfully with this new defiance. William was drawn back to England from Normandy by these troubles, and the unrest continued. In 1068, the city of Exeter rose against Norman authority, and William moved against it with characteristic directness, laying siege until the town negotiated its surrender. Simultaneously, a broader northern rebellion gathered shape, the former Earls Edwin and Morcar, Gospatric and Welsh allies pooling their grievances into coordinated resistance. Edgar the Etheling, that enduring symbol of Anglo-Saxon legitimacy, continued to serve as a figurehead around whom opposition could coalesce, even as his practical military power remained limited. Harold's sons, exiled in Ireland, launched raids along the western coasts. The rebellions were not isolated sparks, they were a pattern. Against all of this, Norman castles were not merely symbols of power, they were its instruments. The genius of the Motte and Bailey design lay in its simplicity and speed. Labourers, often drawn from the conquered local population, would pile earth into a high, steep-sided mound called the motte, surrounding it with a ditch. Atop the motte rose a timber keep, the final refuge, commanding views across the surrounding countryside. Beside the motte stretched the bailey, an enclosed courtyard of wooden palisade walls that housed soldiers, horses, workshops, and stores. An entire fortification of this kind could be raised in a matter of weeks, not years. And so the Norman garrison spread across England, into the towns, across the river crossings, along the roads, roughly 500 castles in all during William's reign, about 2/3 of them planted within towns and cities to dominate their centres. The most strategically vital of these fortifications were chosen with careful deliberation. Pevensey and Hastings anchored the southern coast. Dover watched the narrow sea. Cambridge, Lincoln, Norwich, Nottingham, Warwick and York controlled the inland roads and rivers. And in London, beside the Thames, on the very foundations of the old Roman city wall, William began what would become the most enduring symbol of Norman power on English soil. The Tower of London rose slowly through the late 1060s and into the following decade. Its great central keep, the White Tower, was begun around 1078, a massive stone structure some 36 metres long, 32 wide, and 27 metres high, rising in pale limestone above the river. Its purpose was threefold: fortress, royal residence, and declaration. Anyone sailing up the Thames, any merchant entering London's wharves, any English subject passing near the old city walls would see it and understand, without the need for words, who now held this land. But castles alone could not hold a kingdom forever if the human fabric of resistance was not broken. And in the north, that resistance was most fierce. The northern rebellions of 1069 were set into motion by a particular provocation. William had appointed a foreign mercenary, Robert de Comines, as the new Earl of Northumbria. The Northumbrians responded with shocking violence. Robert and his men were killed at Durham. Almost simultaneously, a Danish fleet commanded by Asbjorn, brother of King Sweyn II of Denmark, arrived in the Humber estuary, landing to join forces with the English rebels. Edgar the Etheling came south from Scotland to lead them. Gospatrick, who had initially submitted to William, rejoined the northern cause. Together, the rebels seized York and destroyed the Norman castles that had been built there. For a moment, the north was lost. Sweyn II had dispatched this fleet believing England might slip from Norman hands entirely. But William moved with the controlled, relentless energy that defined his campaigns. He marched north and bought off the Danish fleet with payment, severing it from the rebellion. Then, in the winter of 1069 and into 1070, he did something that contemporaries found almost impossible to describe without falling into the language of apocalypse. The harrying of the north was not a battle. It was a systematic erasure. William's forces moved through Yorkshire, Durham and Northumberland, and into the lands that would later form Lancashire, Cumberland and Westmoreland. They burned villages, they slaughtered livestock, they destroyed stored grain, tools, anything that could sustain human life through a northern winter. Settlements that had stood for generations were reduced to ash and silence. The land was not merely conquered, it was emptied. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing some decades later, described a king who stopped at nothing, who condemned the guilty and the innocent alike to starvation, who in a single winter campaign may have brought death to 100,000 or more. Simeon of Durham recorded the wholesale destruction of the north, a famine so severe that survivors were driven to extremes of hunger that no dignified chronicle could fully describe. Florence of Worcester wrote that William spent the whole of that winter laying waste to the country without cessation. The Domesday Survey of 1086, compiled 16 years after the harrying, offers a quieter but no less devastating testimony. Roughly 60% of Yorkshire's holdings were recorded simply as waste. Land values had collapsed, in some cases falling to a tenth of what they had been before the Conquest. Only about a quarter of the pre-harrying population and plough teams remained. The loss of perhaps 80,000 oxen alone speaks to the totality of agricultural destruction. Archaeologists have found hordes of coins buried in the late 1060s and never reclaimed, the silent markers of people who hid what they could and never returned. The land between York and Durham lay essentially empty for roughly a decade. Even by 1086, full recovery was still far away. Most historians who have studied the evidence agree that true demographic and economic recovery in the north took well over a century, stretching into the 12th and 13th centuries before the region found its footing again. Orderic Vitalis later recorded that on his deathbed, William expressed regret, that he lamented having persecuted the English people and being stained with rivers of blood. Whether those words were truly spoken, and whether they carried the weight of genuine remorse or the fears of a dying man, history cannot say with certainty. While William's military campaigns reshaped the land itself, his governance of the church brought its own quiet transformation. In 1070, he appointed Lanfranc of Bec, an Italian-born scholar of considerable distinction, prior of the Great Ormond Abbey at Bec, and later abbot of St. Stephen in Caen, as Archbishop of Canterbury. Lanfranc set about reordering the English church with the same methodical thoroughness that William had applied to the redistribution of land. Anglo-Saxon bishops and senior clergy were replaced with Norman appointees. At the Council of Winchester in 1072, Canterbury's primacy over York was formally established. Regular synods were convened. Clerical celibacy was enforced. Cathedral chapters were reformed. The church that emerged from these years was still Catholic, still connected to Rome, but its practical relationship with the papacy had changed in subtle and important ways. William required royal permission before papal letters could circulate in England. Bishops could not travel to Rome without his leave. Ecclesiastical lands were brought under the same feudal obligations as secular estates. The English Church became in effect a deeply English institution in the sense that it answered first to its king. The physical evidence of this transformation rose in stone across the landscape. Norman Romanesque architecture, with its massive walls, rounded arches, chevron ornamentation, and soaring interior spaces, began to replace the older Anglo-Saxon wooden and modest stone churches. Durham, Canterbury, Ely, Gloucester. These great cathedrals took shape in this period, their silhouettes permanently altering the skyline of the English imagination. The early rib vaults at Durham carried within them the seeds of what would one day become Gothic architecture, though no one standing beneath those arches in the late 11th century could have known it. And the land itself had been redistributed with a thoroughness that reshaped English society for centuries. William seized the estates of the resisting Anglo-Saxon elite and granted them to his Norman followers as fiefs in exchange for military service and loyalty. Those Norman tenants-in-chief then subdivided their holdings further, creating a layered pyramid of obligation that traced all the way back to the crown. The Domesday Survey captured the result. The share of land held by small Anglo-Saxon owners had fallen from around 22% before the Conquest to barely 2% by 1086. Large landholders, now almost exclusively Norman, had risen from holding 43% to 64%. The king's own share had grown from 12 to 23%. Of the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, only a handful survived with any meaningful holdings. By 1086, perhaps 10% of the former elite reduced to subordinate tenures, many holding their land conditionally through marriage into Norman families or through sworn fealty to new masters. The rest had been killed in battle, or the subsequent rebellions, driven into exile in Scotland, Wales, or the continent, or had taken service in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, Saxon warriors carrying their swords to the courts of Constantinople, far from the fields they had once called home. England had been remade, not in one stroke, but in layer upon layer of castle, charter, appointment and campaign, each one quietly cementing what the last had begun. Through castles, campaigns and the systematic reorganisation of land and church, William had imposed Norman power across England, but he was not content to rule by force alone, and his greatest administrative achievement was yet to come. Chapter 6: The Domesday King, Legacy, Death, and the World William Made. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over great empires in their final hours. A quietness that hangs in the air like dust after a long journey, as though history itself pauses to take a breath before turning the page. By the year 1085, William the Conqueror had ruled England for nearly 2 decades. The land he had taken by force had slowly, painstakingly been reshaped in his image. Castles rose where Saxon halls had once stood. Norman lords governed where English thanes had once presided. And yet, even now, even at the height of his power, William could not rest. Word had reached the king that a great Danish fleet, backed by a broader alliance of Scandinavian forces, was gathering across the northern seas. The threat of invasion loomed once more, At the same time, war with France threatened to drag him back across the Channel. His treasury needed filling, his armies needed sustaining, and William, ever the administrator as much as the warrior, understood that to meet these demands, he first needed to know precisely what he possessed. And so, in the winter of 1085, William commanded something that had never been attempted before in England, a complete and comprehensive survey of the entire kingdom. Royal commissioners were sent out across the land, dividing England into 7 great circuits, each covering several counties. Teams of clerks, prelates, and senior barons rode from shire to shire, holding sworn inquests in the chief town of each county. Sheriffs summoned the landholders. Tenants and subtenants were called to answer. Representatives of each hundred and every village were required to appear before these royal commissions and speak truthfully under oath. The questions they were asked were precise and searching. For every manor in England, the commissioners wanted to know its name, who had held it in 1066 on the eve of the Conquest, who held it now, how much land did it contain measured in hides and plough teams, how much woodland, meadow and pasture, how many mills, how many fisheries, and what had it been worth then, and what was it worth now? The people who answered, speaking in English, speaking in French, their words carefully recorded by royal scribes, gave testimony that would outlast every one of them by 1,000 years and more. The information gathered was carried back to Winchester, where it was translated into Latin, carefully edited, and compiled into what became 2 great volumes. The larger covered most of England. A second, smaller volume recorded the detailed findings for Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk. Together, these volumes became the definitive record of English landholding and wealth, a document so thorough, so authoritative, and so final in its judgments that later generations gave it a name drawn from the most absolute reckoning they could imagine. They called it the Domesday Book. The word came from the Middle English for doomsday, the last judgment. Just as no appeal could be made against the verdict of that final day, no appeal could be made against the entries recorded within these pages. The 12th century treasurer Richard Fitz-Neal explained the name plainly. The book's decisions were final and could not be overturned. What the Domesday Book revealed was a portrait of England utterly transformed. Before the Conquest, land had been held by a broad and varied community of Anglo-Saxon lords and free landholders. By 1086, that world had been dismantled almost entirely. The survey showed that roughly 8% of recorded landholders were native English, and they held less than 1/10 of the kingdom's total value. Large Norman landholders, who had held less than half the land's value before the Conquest, now controlled nearly 2/3 of it. The king's own estates had nearly doubled. It was a redistribution of wealth and property on a scale England had never witnessed, and the Domesday Book recorded it all with the calm, unhurried precision of a kingdom taking inventory of itself. The survey was not without its silences. London and Winchester, the 2 greatest cities of the realm, were left unrecorded, their complexity and sheer volume of detail making them impractical for the rapid royal inquest. Several northern counties, Northumberland, Cumberland, Westmoreland and County Durham, also remained outside the survey's reach, either still beyond William's firm control under Scottish dominion, or exempt because the Prince Bishop of Durham held exclusive tax authority there. But for the vast remainder of England, the Domesday Book stood as a monument to royal ambition and administrative will. Yet even as this great record was being completed, William's own days were drawing quietly toward their end. The tensions between William and his elder son Robert had never fully healed. Robert Curthose, a nickname meaning short boots, had long chafed under his father's dominion. He had rebelled openly in 1077, attempted to seize Rouen Castle, fled to Flanders, and waged raids in the borderlands before submitting. The conflict had reached its most dramatic moment in the winter of 1079 at the Siege of Gerberoi, where Robert, fighting alongside his father's enemies, managed to knock William himself from his horse, wounding him and forcing a humiliating retreat. It was only when Robert recognised his father's voice in the confusion of battle that he drew back. Queen Matilda had eventually brokered a fragile reconciliation, and by the spring of 1080 William had formally reaffirmed Robert's right to inherit the Duchy of Normandy. But the wound between father and son never entirely closed. Robert found a willing ally in Philip I of France, a clever Capetian king who understood that a rebellious Norman heir made a useful counterweight to William's ambitions. Philip had already thwarted William's attempts to expand into Brittany, and had supported Robert as a standing irritant against the English crown. By 1087, the tensions along the Norman frontier had grown sharp once more. The final cause of William's last campaign was a particular insult from the French king, an affront to William's pride that the chroniclers record with the quiet weight of something that could not go unanswered. William gathered his forces and marched into the Vexin that contested borderland between Normandy and France. His specific target was the town of Mantes. The town was taken and put to the torch. Flames climbed through the streets, and it was here, riding through the burning ruins, that the long thread of William's life began to unravel. His horse stumbled in the heat and chaos. The pommel of the saddle struck William's exposed abdomen with terrible force. The wound was internal, deep and grievous, and the king who had survived so many battles found himself broken not by an enemy's sword, but by the violence of a stumble in a town already conquered. He was carried to Rouen. For weeks he lingered, growing gradually weaker as the summer heat deepened around him. Contemporary chroniclers record that on his deathbed, William spoke with unusual reflection. He confessed his sins. He acknowledged that his conquest of England, particularly the terrible harrying of the north, had been a grave wrong, and he asked forgiveness for what he had done. He died on a Thursday in early September of 1087. What followed was, by any measure, an undignified end for a king of such power. The moment his breath ceased, the room was plundered. Those who had attended him hurried away, taking arms, vessels, clothing, whatever could be carried. William's body was left almost naked on the floor. Only a passing knight took the responsibility of seeing the corpse embalmed and transported to Caen, to the Abbey of Saint-Étienne, the great church William himself had built. The journey across the summer heat left the body badly decomposed by the time it arrived. When the monks attempted to place the king in the stone sarcophagus prepared for him, the coffin proved too short. As they forced the bloated remains inside, the swollen bowels ruptured, filling the cathedral with a stench so overwhelming that the assembled clergy and mourners turned and fled. Even the incense could not contain it. The funeral rites were concluded in haste, the burial completed with far less ceremony than the man's life had commanded. Before he died, William had divided his inheritance among his sons. Robert Curthose, despite everything, received what had long been promised, the Duchy of Normandy. His second son, William Rufus, was granted the English crown. His youngest son Henry received a substantial legacy of £5,000 of silver, but no land. William had chosen to honour his promise to Robert while placing a trusted heir on the English throne, avoiding further fragmentation of his already complex Anglo-Norman realm. The world that came after moved quickly. William Rufus ruled England as William II until a hunting accident in the New Forest, the very forest his father had created, ended his life in the year 1100. Henry then seized the English throne, reigning as Henry I for another 35 years. Robert Curthose, who had joined the First Crusade and briefly threatened to reclaim England, was defeated by Henry at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106 and spent the remaining 28 years of his life imprisoned, dying at Cardiff Castle in 1134. The England that William had made did not disappear with any of them. It had already sunk too deeply into the soil. The Domesday Book remained, housed eventually at the National Archives at Kew, its Latin entries still legible after 9 centuries, still consulted by historians and legal scholars alike. The castles remained, the White Tower of London, raised between 1076 and 1100, the great keeps of Richmond and Kenilworth and Goodrich, the Motte and Bailey earthworks scattered across the countryside, the New Forest, which William had designated a royal hunting ground in 1079, still stretches across Hampshire, its ancient character shaped by the forest laws of a Norman king. And the language itself carried William's world forward in ways too numerous to count. When the Norman rulers spoke their French among the conquered English, 2 languages began to weave together. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of all modern English words carry French origins. Words for government, for law, for the table, for clothing, for war. Parliament, jury, verdict, beef, pork, mutton, gown, cabinet. The very structure of English shifted, its old inflections falling away, its word order becoming more fixed, its vocabulary expanding into something richer and stranger than either language had been alone. The Norman conquest did not merely change who ruled England, it changed the very tongue with which the English would speak for centuries to come. Historians across the centuries have never quite agreed on what to make of William. Norman chroniclers celebrated him as a divinely sanctioned conqueror. Victorian scholars praised him as a bringer of order and civilization. Later historians turned more critical, counting the bodies left by the harrying of the north, tallying the dispossessed English landholders, measuring the cultural suppression that accompanied Norman rule. The current understanding holds him somewhere between all of these, an astute and effective ruler who built something durable, and a ruthless conqueror whose methods inflicted suffering on a scale that history cannot quietly set aside. Perhaps that complexity is appropriate. Great transformations are rarely clean. The world William made was not made gently. It was made through force and administration, through law and displacement, through fire and parchment. And yet the world it became, the English language, the common law, the institutions of state, the very idea of a unified English kingdom, carries within it, invisibly and enduringly, the mark of what happened in 1066 and in all the years that followed. And so the story of William the Conqueror does not end with his death. It continues in every stone castle, every word borrowed from French, every line of the Domesday Book, and every institution of the English state that carries quietly and invisibly the shadow of 1066.